So I told my wife the other day as I was getting ready for tonight that I was probably more nervous to talk tonight than I have been for a very long time. I get paid to talk, and so she asked me why I was more nervous, and I said, well, not because of what I have to talk about as much as I have to talk to a room full of teenagers. The cruelest people on earth.
Some of us do that for
No, you all are. There is no doubt. And so if I seem nervous, I apologize. I'll try to do my best in talking to you guys tonight. And before I get started really into the meat of what I want to talk about, I first want to thank our sponsors tonight, because, you know, when Paige contacted me and we spoke about talking, I said, you know, my advice, my wisdom, my guidance is my commodity. You know, I sell that on a daily basis. I'm an attorney. That's what I do for a living. And, you know, she said, okay. She said, well, maybe I can think of something, and maybe we can see if we can work some compensation for you. I thought everybody else got paid too.
What? You got paid?
Well, that's the deal. She called me about a week or so later after that first conversation. She was a little discouraged. Then she called me back, and she said she had figured out a solution. So, Sean Purcell, we want to thank you for sponsoring tonight. Jim Owens, and my wife will be getting your mailing addresses for the bill. I did reduce it down. I'm just going to charge you a nickel a second.
That's going to talk quicker.
And I will start right now. So, for your pecuniary purposes, I would recommend that you go ahead and start timing, okay, buddy? And for any of you Aggies out there, I will say pecuniary means financial or money, okay? I'll try to make it leveled out for you. So tonight, my talk is on
money.
past, present, future Aggies. My topic tonight is the last in this series. It's titled Failed But Not a Failure. And I figured the best way to start to talk about tonight was to tell you all about some of my failures. It took a while for me to determine really what the best ones were to talk to you guys about, and so I selected a few of the highlights, if you will, to kind of let you guys know a little bit about me. So, when I was in the 8th grade, I was on the football team at the Haskell, with the Haskell Hawks. Some of you are old enough to remember who that is. And we played a game at Sand Springs Central. And after the game, I failed to get on the bus.
Oh, that's really tough.
Now, keep in mind, there were no cell phones at this time. I'm in a football uniform. I have no money. And I don't know where we are, because at 14 years old, nobody has a concept of distance still as far as vehicles are concerned. So I got to walk up the hill to the little convenience store there in Sand Springs and try to call people collect. But you know, you can't call your mom and dad collect on their cell phone because they don't have a cell phone. And you don't know any relatives' numbers memorized necessarily. So I got stranded in Sand Springs for a good while. In the 8th grade, and needless to say, I got to run a lot after practice.
Yeah.
When I was in the 5th grade, I was in the finals of the school spelling bee at Oakcrest. And I was on the second word to win it. Itemize. I added an extra E at the end. I do not know how you do that.
Genius.
That was a colossal failure. I mean, seriously, I had to, like, think about it to add an E. I mean, that's not even a word.
Yes.
So, it's terrible. I can still get worked up about that one, I promise you. Without a doubt. After Andrea and I, my wife, were married, I went to law school at OU, and we were living in a duplex. And I had come home late one night after studying, and I decided that I was going to mess with her, and we had a little short hallway. At the end of that hallway was her bedroom, and there was a bed basically right there lined up down the hallway. So I said, I'm going to run down that hallway and go Superman on that bed and mess with her because she was ostensibly sleeping. The problem is I did not realize that she had rearranged the bedroom furniture when I was gone out to my night of studying, and I did not hit the bed. I hit it full on the floor. It did not feel good. I failed to realize that she had done that, and it hurt. Bad. I was not happy. When I was a senior here at Broken Arrow in '92, I was chosen to be a counselor at Student Council Basic Camp. Some of you know what that is?
Yep.
Do they still have that?
Yes.
So I was a counselor, and we had to show up early. It was at NSU, Tahlequah. We had to show up early. And myself and the state, I don't know, officers, other counselors. And one night, don't ask me why, I got a conversation which resulted in me effectively having a Drano bomb blow up in my hand out the dorm window and getting the school suspended for having a school counselor, or for a counselor at Basic the next year. That was a pretty big fail on my end. It was not pretty, I can assure you. So that was a one that I had to deal with and live with. Luckily, it did not haunt me too awfully bad. It would probably get the ATF called on you today, but in 1992, it wasn't as big of a deal, fortunately. And if you don't want to know what I'm talking about, don't go look it up. It was on Mr. Wizard's World, man. You guys remember that show that are like at least 40s, right? Purcell, you watch that all the time.
Absolutely.
And the last one, well, there's two more. The second to last one is one that happened a few years ago on Valentine's Day. I'm not a card person. My wife loves cards. Like for holidays and stuff, I could care less. And so that doesn't mesh real well. But I always have to go get her a card. I always wait for the last minute. And I always run in somewhere and get something, right? So here a few years ago, gave her her card, and she opens it up, and she's like, what are you doing? I said, what do you mean? She says, shows it to me, the front said, for my husband. I had not paid attention. I had failed to look at the front of the card, and only read the inside. I liked what the inside said, but I failed to look at the outside, so that was kind of a problem. So, all those, obviously, now that I've self-deprecated myself for a few minutes, all of those are failures that I've had throughout my life. I'm going to talk about actually one more, and that's the one I kind of want to focus on tonight, and probably one of the most teaching stories or telling stories that I've ever had. And it can be summed up in one word, and that is woman. Now, it is not what you think. For those of you that are thinking, oh yeah, this dummy just having his biggest failure in the world. Now my wife's not here anyway, so. But no, I'm not. This failure started long before I met my wife. It goes back to, believe it or not, the first grade. And when I started Broken Arrow Schools in the first grade. I was at Oakcrest, but I'd gone to kindergarten at Union over at Roy Clark. And for some reason, I had stayed in at kindergarten and learned how to read instead of going to recess. And so when I came to Broken Arrow Schools, they didn't teach reading at the kindergarten level at that time. So I was already out of picture books, and the other kids were still on CAT. And so I got put in my own reading group, which kind of went to my head. And, you know, I got, hey, you know, I can read all these other kids out, you know, hey. And so very early in the year, I'm back there, just me and the teacher. And I'm reading. And I was smart enough I could pick up on the picture clues and things like that. So if I got stuck, but this wasn't, like I said, I was out of picture books. And so I come to this word. That was it. And for some reason, my brain would not let me figure out what that word was. And I sat there and tried to pronounce that word for a good 10 or 15 minutes. I don't know how many times I said that word over and over and over, making the same pronunciation mistake over and over and over, and my brain would not click. I am sure that I was very frustrated. Anybody that knows me can probably tell you that can't happen. I am sure I looked at my teacher at one point and said, surely I've gotten it right by now. Surely I've said it right at least once. You're just messing with me. I know you are. And it was like beating my head against the wall. And then the end of reading group came. And that was that. And I hadn't gotten it right. And I couldn't go on. Even if I asked her, she would not let me. My first grade teacher. And so I was stubborn, and we didn't have Google anyway, and certainly didn't have Siri to go, hey Siri, let me say this. So, and I didn't want to ask my parents. That's just not my way. And so, went home, came back the next day, probably spent about half the day, the second day, trying to say one word. It was probably the most helpless feeling I have ever had in my life. It was awful. I could not believe it. I couldn't understand it. I was ready to start throwing stuff. I couldn't. My teacher just smiling at me. You can do it. You can get it. But how much help can you give on that word? Come on. Finally, I got it. I was happy, to say the least. Excited, relieved. It was a wonderful feeling of joy. And my teacher, she was just as happy with me. She celebrated it with me. And she never got frustrated during the whole day and a half it took me to learn how to say that one word. And that story for years was one that when I looked back, all I could think about was the helpless feeling that I had. All I could think about was the repeated incorrect words over and over and over, the same mistake over and over and over. And it was, I didn't like that feeling. I didn't like that memory. It was not a good one. And so, you know, maturity does things for people. And as I've gotten older, I have come to realize that really, that was probably one of the earliest God sightings that I ever had, and that my teacher in first grade, Mrs. Farrar, was probably as good of an embodiment of Christ and God that I had seen up to that point, and as far as a specific example that I might ever see. She really exemplified everything that God and Jesus want us to exemplify. I didn't grow up in the church. We went to church when I was younger. We were members of Sheridan Avenue Christian Church. It was a non-denominational church over at 4th and Sheridan. I'm the oldest of 3 boys. So 3 boys, all 3 playing 3 sports for most of the year. I think Sundays were as sacred to my parents at times as they were to God Himself to rest. And so there were lots of Sundays we did not go to church. I've always felt very uncomfortable, actually, when we would go. Primarily because the kids that were there all the time, they knew each other. I felt like they always were more knowledgeable about the Bible or anything religion related. And so it wasn't something that I necessarily looked forward to. God and church was not a central part of the house that I grew up in. My parents were wonderful parents in many respects, but religion, church, were not things that necessarily they focused on or put central in our lives, myself and both my younger brothers. And so I actually was baptized when I was 15, which is not necessarily the way we do it in the Methodist Church. And like I said, I attended church. When I got to college, I went to school at Cornell in New York. And when I got there, it is largely Catholic and largely Jewish. And so I actually did attend church some, just on my own when I was in college, but I went to a very small Baptist church that was in a building that was probably about the size of this room, and they, like put up partitions for classes and stuff. But it wasn't something that was a central part of my life at that time. And really it didn't, church and God did not really become a central part of my life, really until I got married, and my wife started dragging me up here. And so, because this is the church she effectively grew up in with her parents, and I started coming regularly. We were in Alpha with Brian Mangan when he was here, and somehow I got conned into like leading follow-up groups. Why they want somebody like me that didn't grow up in the church and has what he believes to be limited biblical knowledge, leading that stuff. I wasn't real sure, but I did. I actually did it for about 3 years. It was really at that time that I started making Christ a focus of my life. And, what I wanted to talk to you all and impress upon you guys tonight is failure is going to happen in your lives. Sin is effectively failure. And we are all born into that. Sin is not an option. It's actually mandatory. I mean, you're not going to have a choice. God gave us free will, but He didn't give us free will over at least one item, and that is the determination of whether or not you are going to sin. And because of that, and because we know that everybody's going to fail in some capacity. It may not be, getting left behind on the bus or air diving and missing a bed, but it's going to happen to you. It might be small, it might be large, you never know, but you're going to fail, you're going to fall short in the eyes of God, because we all do. We don't have a choice in that matter. We are born into it. In Romans, let me put that verse up. In Romans, it says, "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, in this way death came to all people, because all sinned." And actually, there's 2 other verses. In Romans 3, "The righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." I'm going to stop there because I think it's important to note that sin is a pretty black and white issue. There's not degrees of sin. When we're being judged, I cannot fathom that God is going to judge us, and some of us are going to have adultery in the 4th degree, or misdemeanor envy, or something of that nature. There's not going to be a grading, if you will, of our failures and our sins. God is not going to look at it that way. It's either you did or you didn't, and it is going to be the same answer for every one of us. That is, we did. And you hear the question asked all the time, somebody that kills someone, do they have the same opportunity at salvation as somebody that doesn't really commit that type of act during their lifetime? And that is between them and God, and their heart and their belief. and His judgment. And it's not something that we need even really speculate about necessarily. When we are taking care of our own lives. You know, Jason Moore talked about playing the comparison game in the first week. When we fail, it's not comparatively to others. When we sin, it's not comparatively to others. It's only you. And so I want everybody to understand that, you know, God is equally loving, and He will judge all of you as He sees in His eyes fit and equally. The sin that was on the earth after God created Adam and Eve, and after the fall, which is what gave us the, I don't want to say ability, but it gave us the omen of being born into sin. You know, God hit the reset button. He flooded everything, got rid of everything except Noah, wife, a bunch of animals. Original natural selection, right? And so he put them on a boat and repopulated the earth after that. And that was effectively hitting a reset button, but He didn't just completely wipe out sin. Instead, He gave us Jesus Christ to address that disconnect we have with Him based upon that sin that we are born into. And so, you know, He didn't eliminate sin because He couldn't eliminate free will. And in Romans 5, is it 3:4? I think is the next one. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And it is through that suffering, through our failures, through our sins, that suffering is created, that sorrow is created. And that sorrow is what is necessary for us to develop that relationship that we need to have with Jesus Christ and with the Father. And in 2 Corinthians 10, it even says, "For God sometimes uses sorrow in our lives to help us turn away from sin and seek eternal life. We should never regret His sending it, but the sorrow of the man who is not a Christian is not the sorrow of true repentance and does not prevent eternal death." So we can't just necessarily have hope. We can't just necessarily blindly go through life. We can't just necessarily continue to sin, knowing that God sent Jesus to save us from that. Because if we do that, we are in effect turning away from God. And that is just as bad as actually not believing in Him in the first place. When we are born, we are all born to, in some capacity, fail. There are numerous stories in the Bible that expose significant failures. Adam and the fall. The prodigal son, which is the one that I wanted to discuss a little bit tonight. You've all heard it. You all know what story I'm talking about. But it is the failure of the prodigal son that is just so amazing. And yet the father asked for him back. And usually that story is used to discuss things other than necessarily the failure of the prodigal son himself. It's usually used to discuss the way the father welcomed him back. And the focus is not on the failure, but the failure is really what prompted him to go back. It was the feeling that he had in his stomach, like the feeling I had when I couldn't say the word woman, of hopelessness that drove him closer to God. And it was that feeling of hopelessness that led him back to his father. And his father rejoiced with him. And it was when I was reading that story in preparation for tonight that I thought of the story of me not being able to say woman. Because realistically, as I looked back, the teacher that I had was very, very much like the father of the prodigal son. The prodigal son, he'd gone and wasted and squandered, done everything he shouldn't have done, continued to fail. And while I wasn't doing that necessarily sitting at the little desk in her classroom, I still repeatedly failed over and over and over again. And I'm sure it was driving her absolutely nuts to listen to me sit and repeat my failure, 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 failure over and over. I don't know how many times I said the word. It had to be an unbelievable number. And yet she sat there. She never stopped smiling. She never stopped nodding. She never stopped encouraging. She guided me, but she didn't give me the answer. And that is exactly what God does for us. He sits. He offers His grace to us. He allows us the free will to make decisions, both good and bad. He allows us, it has actually, in essence, required us to fail. We don't have a choice. And when we do, He is there to encourage us, to assist us, to keep pushing us onward. And once that we hopefully come around to that point in our lives when we are ready to accept His grace, then He welcomes us with open arms and He celebrates with us. And when I look back on that story now, that, the story of my inability to read, when I look back on that, that is what I get from it. That is what I take from it, not the memory of my failure and the hopelessness and irritation and frustration that I had, but how happy that I was when I finally got it right, and how happy my teacher was. Now, you know, maybe she was just happy that she didn't have to sit and listen to me for another day and a half and mispronounce the word wrong. But she was genuinely overjoyed that I did that. And we are not given the option of whether or not we sin and are effectively, you know, the wages of sin is death. We are given the opportunity and the option to accept God's grace and be saved and have eternal life. And, you know, when we talk about goals in our lives, I know you guys get sick of that, I'm sure. You know, your teachers and everybody else, your coaches and stuff, talk about, you guys probably make them talk about goals too, I don't know. But I'm sure, you know, that's something that's been discussed with you guys a lot. But, you know, realistically speaking, when somebody says, hey, what's the goal for your life? You know, has anybody ever said, why am I, you know, you mean like life here? You know, I mean, I don't know. Is that the question they're asking? I never really thought about it, but, you know, realistically speaking, my goal is to have eternal life with God and with people that I love. And if that is a, you know, a goal that I hope everyone has, it is going to be your decision whether or not you achieve that or whether you fail to achieve that. The Bible tells us how we can achieve that. It's our job to go out and live that life that God's asked us to live, to try to be more Christ-like, and to accept the grace that God has offered us through His Son. So pray with me. Heavenly Father, thank You for allowing us to come together tonight. Please be with these youth as they go into their small groups and discuss Your Word and Your life and our work here on this earth. May they safely travel home and return next week. In Your Son's name we pray.